driver's daughter. I still remember that moment as vividly as if it happened yesterday. The fluorescent lights in the boardroom buzzed softly above us, the smell of polished leather chairs and freshly brewed coffee filling the air, while dozens of eyes darted between me and the man sitting at the head of the long mahogany table. My hands trembled as I clutched the notes I had carefully prepared, my heart pounding so loud I could almost hear it echoing in the silence. For weeks, I had rehearsed this moment in my bedroom, whispering the words over and over until I could recite them in my sleep, praying that when the time came, my voice wouldn't betray me. This was supposed to be my chance to prove myself, to show them that I was more than just the daughter of a driver. But instead, what I got was laughter. The CEO leaned back in his chair, his diamond-studded watch catching the light as he tilted his head, smirking in a way that made the entire room feel smaller. He didn't even bother to hide the disdain in his voice when he spoke. "Really?" he scoffed, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Are we seriously entertaining ideas from a driver's daughter? What's next? Asking the janitor's kid to run the company?" The sound of his laughter rolled across the table, sharp and merciless, filling the room with a cruelty that made the others shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some tried to look away, their eyes falling to the papers in front of them, while others bit their lips as if unsure whether to laugh along or stay silent. But no one said a word in my defense. It was in that instant that the class divide felt like a knife pressed against my throat. I wasn't just an employee's daughter in his eyes. I was nothing. Less than nothing. My presence was a joke, an inconvenience, a blemish on the polished surface of his empire. And for a moment, standing there with all those eyes on me, I felt myself shrinking into that role, becoming exactly what he said I was. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the sting of humiliation burning deep into my skin. My father's image flashed in my mind, his tired hands gripping the steering wheel after 12-hour shifts, his back bent from years of labor, his smile hiding the exhaustion he carried like a shadow. He had given everything to that man, serving loyally for decades, and in return, his daughter was nothing more than an easy target for mockery. The CEO's arrogance wasn't new to me. I had seen it countless times when I waited for my father outside the gates of the mansion, or when I watched him step out of expensive cars dressed in custom-tailored suits. But this public humiliation, was something else. It wasn't just arrogance. It was a performance, a reminder to everyone in the room of how power worked, of who mattered and who didn't. He was the king, untouchable in his fortress of glass and steel, and I was a nobody, foolish for even daring to step inside. Yet as much as the humiliation crushed me, there was something else brewing beneath the surface, something sharper, hotter, more dangerous than shame. Anger. Not the kind that explodes outward in an instant, but the kind that simmers quietly, burning slowly until it becomes impossible to contain. I lowered my gaze to the floor, not because I was defeated, but because I couldn't trust my face to hide the storm inside me. Every laugh that echoed in that room carved itself into my memory, etching a scar so deep I knew it would never fade. I wanted to scream, to remind them that intelligence wasn't born from privilege, that hard work and sacrifice meant more than their titles and wealth. But instead, I bit my tongue, let the laughter wash over me, and stood in silence. Silence can be mistaken for weakness, but that day, it became my armor. As the CEO's laughter died down, he waved his hand dismissively, as if brushing away a speck of dust. "That will be all," he said, turning to the others with a smirk. "Let's focus on ideas that actually matter." His words weren't just a rejection, they were an erasure, a declaration that my voice didn't deserve to exist in that space. I gathered my papers slowly, every movement heavy, my eyes stinging as I fought to keep the tears at bay. I knew if I cried, it would only give him more satisfaction, more proof that I was too fragile for his world. So I forced myself to hold my head high, even as my insides crumbled, and walked out of that boardroom with the weight of 100 stairs pressing down on my back. Outside, in the empty hallway, I finally let out the breath I had been holding. The silence there was deafening, but it was different. It was mine. And in that quiet, I made myself a promise born out of humiliation, anger, and a determination I hadn't known I possessed until that moment. He thought his laughter had ended my story. He believed his words had placed me in a box I could never escape. But what he didn't realize was that his mockery had lit a fire in me that would only grow stronger with time. Every word, every smirk, every dismissive gesture, those would become the fuel that carried me forward. He had tried to bury me with shame, but all he had done was plant a seed that was already beginning to take root. And as I walked down that hallway, clutching my notes with trembling hands, one thought echoed louder than his laughter ever could. He thought it was the end of my story, but it was only the beginning. I walked away without a word, but inside I made a promise I would never break. When I left that boardroom, the laughter still echoing in my ears, I didn't let a single tear fall until I was out of sight. The marble floor beneath my feet felt colder than it had ever been, and the walls, lined with portraits of men who had built empires, seemed to mock me with their silent judgment. Every step I took away from that room was heavy with shame, yet at the same time, there was a strange clarity forming inside me. I realized that humiliation, when endured in silence, doesn't simply disappear. It transforms into something stronger, something unshakable. When I reached the parking lot, my father was waiting, standing by the car he had polished so carefully that morning. His hands, rough and cracked from years of labor, gripped the steering wheel nervously as he watched me approach. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. The look in my eyes told him everything. For a moment, his face softened, his lips parting as if he wanted to speak. But then he lowered his gaze, the weight of guilt pressing his shoulders down. I knew why. He had been the loyal driver of that CEO for nearly 2 decades, and though he loved me more than his own life, his silence inside those walls had not been out of cowardice. It had been out of necessity. He could not risk losing the job that fed our family, the one thing keeping us afloat in a world that had no mercy for people like us. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I didn't blame him, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I slid into the back seat and stared out the window as the city lights blurred past, the reflection of skyscrapers stretching into the dark sky like towers built to remind people of their place. My father's silence filled the car, but it wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, and painful, and yet beneath it all, there was love. A love too deep to be put into words, a love that sacrificed pride for survival. Growing up, I had seen that love in every little thing he did. I remembered the nights he would return home, long after midnight, his uniform wrinkled, his body aching, but still managing a smile as he placed food on the table. I remembered how he never once bought anything for himself, choosing instead to save every spare dollar for my education, even when it meant wearing the same pair of shoes until the soles were nearly gone. And I remembered the stories he used to tell me, not fairy tales or legends, but small moments of his own life, moments of hardship, of loss, of resilience. He never said the words directly, but his life was his way of telling me, "You must go further than I ever could." That night, as we drove home in silence, I realized that the humiliation I had endured wasn't just mine. It was his too. Every insult thrown at me was a shadow cast on his years of sacrifice, a cruel reminder that no matter how hard he worked, people like us would always be dismissed. And in that realization, something inside me hardened. I could no longer allow myself to be defined by their mockery. If I stayed silent forever, then their words would become the truth. But if I turned that silence into strength, if I turned their doubt into fuel, then maybe, just maybe, I could rewrite what it meant to be a driver's daughter. At home, the air was filled with the familiar scent of my mother's cooking, the soft hum of the old radio playing in the background. But I barely tasted the food that night. My mind was already racing, spinning with questions and possibilities. How could I break free from the cage they had built around me? How could I step into a world designed to keep me out? The answers didn't come immediately, but what did come was a certainty that I had never felt before. I didn't know the path, but I knew the destination. Later that evening, I found myself sitting on the worn wooden porch, staring up at the stars. The night was unusually still, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the universe is listening. My father stepped outside, his face lined with exhaustion, and sat beside me without a word. For a long time, we just sat there, two silhouettes under the vast sky, bound together by blood, love, and unspoken pain. Finally, he whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't say anything today." I turned to him, and though my heart ached, I managed a small smile. "You've already said everything I need to hear," I replied, because I knew that his silence wasn't weakness, it was protection, and I loved him too much to let him carry the burden of guilt. What I didn't tell him was that inside me, something had shifted forever. His silence had given me the strength to make a vow, one I whispered into the night sky like a prayer only the stars could hear. I promised myself that I would not let his years of sacrifice be wasted. I promised myself that I would rise above the mockery, above the laughter, above the limitations they tried to place on me. And most importantly, I promised myself that I would one day stand in the very spaces where I had once been ridiculed, not as a shadow, not as a joke, but as someone who commanded respect. The world may have tried to break me in that boardroom, but as I sat under the stars with my father's weary hand resting on mine, I realized that resolve is born not in victory, but in silence. And so, with the echoes of humiliation still haunting me, and the weight of my father's love grounding me, I sealed my vow with a fire that no insult could ever extinguish. That night, I swore someday I'd stand in his world and he'd have to listen. He lived like royalty in his glass tower, untouchable and feared. From the outside, his world looked like something pulled straight out of a fantasy, the kind of life people like me only ever saw in glossy magazines or through tinted windows of passing limousines. His office wasn't just a workspace, it was a throne room, perched high above the city in a skyscraper made almost entirely of glass, its walls gleaming against the sun, as if to remind everyone below of who owned the sky. Each morning when I watched him step out of the car, dressed in tailored suits that probably cost more than our yearly rent, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the divide between us. It wasn't just money that separated his world from mine. It was power, authority, and a belief that he was untouchable. Inside those golden walls, everything about him spoke of excess. The polished marble floors reflected every step like they were capturing pieces of his glory. Paintings from famous artists lined the halls, each one worth more than the small house my father had spent his life paying off. Even the air felt different up there, perfumed with imported scents, chilled perfectly by air systems that never faltered, while outside people like us sweltered in heat or shivered through winters with broken heaters. He had built an empire where luxury was not just enjoyed, it was displayed, flaunted, and worshipped. But what stood out more than his wealth was the way he wielded it. His arrogance wasn't subtle, it was sharp, deliberate, and calculated to remind everyone around him of their place. I saw it in the way he spoke to his executives, cutting them off mid-sentence, his words dripping with impatience. I saw it in the way he dismissed waiters or secretaries, as if their existence was an inconvenience, as if their value began and ended with the service they could provide him. To him, people were tools, replaceable, disposable, and unworthy of respect unless they stood at his level. There were countless stories whispered among employees about his cruelty. A young assistant once spilled coffee on his papers by mistake, her hands trembling as she tried to apologize. Instead of accepting her apology, he humiliated her in front of the entire floor, demanding that she clean it up while reminding everyone that incompetence had no place in his empire. Another time, he cut down a junior executive's presentation, not with constructive criticism, but with mocking laughter that reduced the man to silence. These incidents weren't accidents of temper. They were patterns, deliberate acts designed to reinforce his superiority. Watching him move through his world was like watching a king surveying his kingdom. But it was a kingdom built not on respect, but on fear. People obeyed him, not because they admired him, but because they were terrified of crossing him. Every smile in his direction was strained, every laugh carefully timed, every word chosen with caution, because one wrong move could mean the end of a career. And yet, no matter how many people bent to his will, he still looked down at the rest of us with the same sneer of contempt. It was impossible not to compare his life to ours. While he dined on imported delicacies in crystal-lit rooms, my father and I counted every dollar at the grocery store, deciding what we could afford to leave behind. While he attended galas with chandeliers glittering above him, I sat on the porch of our small house, patching up second-hand clothes under the dim light of a lamp. While he vacationed in private resorts across the globe, we worked through holidays, my father driving him and his guests to airports where luxury jets waited like chariots of the gods. His world was paved with gold, while ours was cracked with sacrifice. What hurt the most was not the difference in wealth, but the way he weaponized it. He didn't just live richly, he made sure everyone else knew they would never reach his level. His mockery of me in that boardroom wasn't an exception. It was a symptom of who he was, a man who believed the world existed to serve him, and that people like me were reminders of a life he had long since trampled beneath his polished shoes. But what he didn't realize was that arrogance has a way of blinding even the most powerful. For all his wealth, all his influence, all his golden walls, he couldn't see beyond his own pride. He thought those walls protected him, that the glass fortress he had built kept him untouchable, but the truth is, walls don't just keep others out. They keep you in. He had trapped himself in a world so detached from reality that he no longer saw the strength of those who lived beyond it. And as I stood on the outside, watching him bask in his own glory, I felt a strange sense of clarity. He believed himself untouchable, but I could already see the cracks in the foundation of his empire. Arrogance breeds carelessness, and carelessness breeds downfall. He laughed at me because he thought I was powerless, but he didn't know that people who grow in the shadows learn to fight harder, to burn brighter, to survive storms he couldn't even imagine. His world of gold was dazzling, yes, but it was also fragile. And one day I knew those walls would come crashing down. But even the strongest walls eventually crack. My father's silence that day broke me more than the insult itself. When I walked out of that boardroom, with my dignity hanging by a thread and humiliation still burning my skin, I thought I had endured the worst part of the day. But when I reached the parking lot and saw my father standing by the car, waiting for me with that familiar mixture of hope and worry in his eyes, the true weight of the moment finally hit me. His gaze lingered on my face for only a second before he looked away, and in that second, I understood everything. He knew what had happened, and the guilt already sat heavy on his shoulders. My father had always been my protector, my shield against the cruelties of the world, but in that moment I realized he couldn't protect me from everything. His silence in that boardroom, his decision to stand still while his employer laughed at me, felt like a blade cutting deeper than the CEO's words ever could. Not because he didn't care, but because I knew he cared too much. The war inside him was one I could almost see written across his tired face, the loyalty that had kept food on our table for years against the love that made him want to rise up and defend me. As I slid into the back seat of the car, I noticed the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, veins straining under the skin. He didn't speak, not even when I shifted uncomfortably, not even when I wanted him to say something, anything that would make the sting go away. Instead, we drove in silence, the city lights flashing across his face, exposing every line carved from years of sacrifice. I realized that he wasn't silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because he had too much to say, too much pain to release, and he didn't know where to begin. I wanted to hate him in that moment. I wanted to scream at him, to ask why he hadn't stood up, why he had let that man tear me down without a word of protest. But the truth was, I couldn't hate him, because I understood. His job was more than just a paycheck. It was survival. It was the roof over our heads, the meals on our table, the school fees he had worked himself to the bone to pay so that I could dream of a better life. He had endured years of disrespect to provide for me, swallowing his pride every single day. And in that boardroom, when the laughter rose against me, he had swallowed it again, because the cost of speaking out would have been losing everything we depended on. Still, understanding didn't make it easier. That night, when we sat at the dinner table, I noticed how quiet he was. My mother tried to ask him about his day, but he only nodded and pushed the food around his plate. His eyes stayed fixed on his hands, rough and scarred from decades behind the wheel, hands that had carried me when I was a child, hands that had always seemed strong and unshakable. Now they trembled slightly, and it broke something inside me. I realized that my humiliation had become his shame too, that he felt the insult just as deeply as I had, but carried it like a stone lodged in his chest. Later that evening, I found him sitting alone on the porch, staring out into the night. The air was heavy, the silence deeper than usual, and I could sense the storm inside him. I sat beside him, and for a long while, neither of us spoke. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I should have said something," he murmured, his words thick with regret. "I should have defended you." I turned to him, my throat tightening as I watched his eyes glisten with unshed tears. This was a man who had endured hardship his entire life, who had bent but never broken. And yet here he was, cracking under the weight of guilt. I wanted to reach out and tell him that it was okay, that I didn't blame him, that I knew he had been protecting me in the only way he could. But I couldn't. My own pain was still too raw, my own wounds too fresh. So instead I just sat there, letting his words hang in the air between us, unspoken forgiveness lingering on my lips but never quite finding its way out. The truth is, my father's silence that day wasn't weakness. It was sacrifice. He had chosen survival over pride, necessity over instinct, and in doing so, he had carried the burden of knowing his daughter was mocked while he stood still. That burden ate at him in ways I would only begin to understand years later. He had lived his life protecting me, and now, for the first time, he had failed. At least that's how he saw it. But in reality, his failure became my strength, because his silence lit a fire in me that words never could. As I lay in bed that night, I could still hear his voice repeating those words. "I should have defended you." They echoed in my mind, mixing with the sound of the CEO's cruel laughter, blending into a symphony of pain and resolve. And as much as it broke me to know my father felt powerless, it also gave me a strange kind of clarity. If he couldn't fight for me, then I would fight for myself. If he couldn't raise his voice without risking everything, then I would raise mine louder than they could ever imagine. Because I knew one day the tables would turn. One day the same man who had laughed at me would be forced to listen, and my father would be there, not silent this time, but watching, proud, as his daughter became everything they said she could never be. He couldn't fight for me then, but he would live to see me fight for myself. Insults can either bury you or build you. I chose the latter. After that day, when the CEO's laughter echoed in my mind like a cruel song I couldn't silence, something inside me shifted. At first, I carried his words like a wound, raw and painful, replaying them in the quiet of the night, feeling them sting again and again until they almost became unbearable. But as days turned into weeks, I realized I had two choices. I could let those words bury me, pressing me deeper into the ground of mediocrity where he believed I belonged, or I could turn them into fuel, the kind of fire that burns so fiercely it forges something new out of pain. And I chose the latter. I threw myself into my studies with a ferocity that startled even me. Every textbook became a battlefield, every late-night study session a war I had to win. While my classmates complained about assignments and deadlines, I treated each one like a stepping stone, proof that I was moving closer to a world that didn't want me in it. There were nights when exhaustion threatened to break me, when the words on the page blurred and my body begged for rest. But then I would hear his laughter again, sharp and humiliating, and it would jolt me awake. His insult became my alarm clock, my motivation, my unrelenting reminder that I could not and would not stay small. But ambition does not come without cost, and in my case, the cost was almost everything. My father's income was barely enough to cover our living expenses, and though he insisted on paying for my education, I knew how much it drained him. There were months when bills piled up on the counter, when we ate simple meals night after night, when my mother quietly patched up old clothes instead of buying new ones. I saw the sacrifices written across their faces, in the lines that deepened on my father's forehead, in the quiet sighs my mother tried to hide as she stretched every dollar further than it should have gone. Each sacrifice carved into me a deeper sense of responsibility, a heavier weight of expectation, but instead of breaking me, it strengthened my resolve. I took on part-time jobs wherever I could find them, waiting tables, tutoring younger students, shelving books in the library. I learned quickly that sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. My days began before the sun rose and ended long after midnight. But even in the blur of exhaustion, I kept my focus sharp. Every paycheck, no matter how small, felt like a victory, not just because it helped ease the burden on my parents, but because it was proof that I was building something of my own, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. And then there were the small wins, the kind that most people might overlook. But for me, they were everything. The first time I scored higher than the wealthy students who had access to private tutors and expensive resources, I felt a surge of pride so strong it erased weeks of fatigue. When a professor praised my work in front of the class, I held on to those words like precious gems, reminders that talent could bloom even in the soil of struggle. Every success, no matter how minor, became another crack in the wall the CEO had tried to build around me. Proof that my place in the world wasn't dictated by the wealth of my family, but by the strength of my will. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in. Late at night, when I was too tired to keep going, I would wonder if it was all worth it. I would think about the boardroom, the smirks, the laughter, and I would question whether I was fooling myself to believe I could ever stand in that world. But then I would remember my father's silence, his guilt, his quiet love, and I would remind myself that this wasn't just about me. It was about him, about my family, about proving that dignity could rise from the very places people looked down on. My ambition wasn't selfish. It was survival. It was justice. It was love made tangible through relentless effort. As time went on, people began to notice. Teachers who had once overlooked me now saw me as one of their brightest students. Employers trusted me with more responsibility. Slowly, my name began to mean something beyond just the driver's daughter. It meant determination. It meant resilience. It meant possibility. And with each small recognition, my vision grew bigger. I no longer dreamed of simply surviving. I dreamed of thriving. I no longer wanted to sit quietly at the edges of the room. I wanted to sit at the head of the table. What fueled me most was the memory of that boardroom, the way my voice had been silenced before it even had the chance to be heard. That image replayed in my mind every time I picked up a book, every time I pushed through exhaustion, every time I forced myself to keep going when it would have been easier to give up. I wasn't just preparing for exams or jobs. I was preparing for that room, for that world, for the moment when I would walk in not as a servant's daughter, but as someone who commanded respect. And though I didn't know how it would happen or when, deep down, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My journey would not end in silence. My ambition was no longer a fragile dream. It was a seed, deeply rooted, watered by sacrifice, nourished by pain, and growing stronger with every passing day. I didn't know how, but I knew one day the boardroom would hear my voice. The first time I stepped into a corporate office, I felt like an outsider in a world made for the wealthy. I remember standing at the entrance of the towering glass building, its sleek windows stretching so high into the sky that they seemed to scrape against the clouds. The revolving doors spun endlessly, swallowing people in expensive suits and polished shoes who carried themselves as if the world had been designed for them, and them alone. My hands trembled slightly as I smoothed down the second-hand blazer I had borrowed from a friend, its shoulders a little too wide, the sleeves brushing awkwardly against my wrists. It didn't matter how many times I had prepared myself for this moment. When I stepped through those doors for the first time, I felt the weight of being an intruder in a kingdom where I did not belong. The lobby itself was a monument to excess. Marble floors gleamed like mirrors beneath golden chandeliers, while a fountain in the center spilled water so gracefully it felt more like an art piece than decoration. Receptionists with flawless makeup and designer heels greeted the newcomers, their voices crisp and polished, while I clutched the strap of my worn-out bag tighter, praying no one noticed the scuffs on my shoes. Every corner of that place screamed wealth and privilege, and I, with my modest background and borrowed clothes, stuck out like a shadow in the middle of sunlight. My first job in that world was not glamorous. It wasn't even close. I was a junior analyst, buried beneath spreadsheets and endless stacks of files, my desk tucked away in the far corner of the office where no one would notice if I vanished. On my first day, I overheard whispers from colleagues, snide remarks about how I had gotten the position through some diversity push, or because they needed a charity case to look good. No one bothered to hide their smirks when they learned who I was, the daughter of a driver. To them, I wasn't competition. I wasn't even worth considering. I was an anomaly, someone out of place, someone who would eventually fade away. Rejection became my constant companion. My suggestions were brushed aside before they were even heard, my efforts dismissed with polite but cutting phrases, like, "That's nice, but we'll go with something more polished." In meetings, I was spoken over, my voice drowned by louder ones belonging to those who wore expensive suits and carried last names that opened doors. Every time I tried to prove myself, I felt invisible, as if I was shouting into a storm that swallowed my words before they could reach anyone's ears. But what they didn't realize was that invisibility can be a powerful weapon. While they ignored me, I watched. While they dismissed me, I listened. I studied the way decisions were made, the subtle shifts in tone that dictated the outcome of meetings, the quiet power struggles that played out in glances and half-smiles. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to understand the rhythm of this world, the hidden rules that governed it. It was during one of those endless nights in the office, when most of my peers had already left for rooftop bars and expensive restaurants, that I first caught a glimpse of what I was capable of. I had stayed late, cleaning up a financial report that one of the senior associates had left in disarray. Numbers had always spoken to me in a way words sometimes couldn't. Where others saw confusion, I saw patterns, stories written in figures and percentages. That night, I reorganized the entire report, found errors that had been overlooked, and highlighted opportunities no one had considered. The next morning, when the report was presented to the executives, they praised the associate who had turned it in, commending his keen eye and sharp analysis. I sat in the corner, my name never mentioned, my contribution invisible. For a moment, bitterness clawed at me, but then a realization settled in. My work had power, even if no one acknowledged it yet. And if I could do it once, I could do it again. That became my quiet rebellion. While others flaunted their connections, I let my work speak in silence. I became the one who stayed the latest, who triple-checked every calculation, who read through contracts line by line until my eyes burned. I was underestimated, yes, but that gave me freedom. Freedom to learn, to grow, to build myself in the shadows without anyone noticing. Still, the struggle to fit in gnawed at me. Office conversations revolved around luxury vacations, private schools, and weekend getaways I could never dream of affording. I laughed politely at jokes I didn't understand, smiled through stories about yacht parties and designer shopping sprees, all the while hiding the truth that I was taking night shifts just to help pay bills at home. I lived in two worlds. The glittering one I walked into every morning, and the modest, struggling one I returned to every evening. And bridging the gap between the two felt like walking a tightrope, each step threatening to send me tumbling. But through the exhaustion and the rejection, through the whispers and the doubt, I held on to one thing: ambition. It pulsed through me like blood, stronger with every obstacle, louder with every dismissal. For every door that was slammed in my face, I told myself there was another one waiting, one I would force open no matter how long it took. There were days when I felt close to breaking, when the weight of rejection threatened to crush me. But then I would remember the promise I had made to myself, the vow I had whispered under the stars with my father sitting beside me. I wasn't just doing this for me, I was doing it for us, for every sacrifice he had made, for every insult we had endured. And that thought kept me standing, even when everything around me pushed me down. It would take time for the world to see me, for my voice to finally rise above the noise, but I knew one thing with certainty: rejection was not the end. It was the sharpening of my blade, the preparation for the moment when I would finally step into the light. Every rejection pushed me closer to the door that would finally open. The whispers never stopped. She'll never make it. She's just a driver's daughter. Everywhere I went, the whispers followed me like a shadow I could never outrun. In the office hallways, in the corners of meeting rooms, even during coffee breaks when laughter filled the air, I could hear them. Subtle, cutting remarks delivered in hushed tones but meant to pierce me all the same. She doesn't belong here. She'll burn out soon. She's just a driver's daughter playing dress-up in a world that isn't hers. They thought their words were quiet enough to go unnoticed. But I heard them, every single one, and though they stung like salt in an open wound, I refused to let them poison me. At first, it was unbearable. Every time I walked past their polished desks or their designer handbags draped casually over chairs, I felt smaller, as though my borrowed clothes and tired eyes exposed me for the outsider I was. Their confidence wasn't just in their work. It was in their lineage, their inherited names, their expensive educations, the invisible armor of privilege they wore so naturally. And then there was me, the girl with no family name to open doors, no private school polish, no golden safety net. I was raw, unrefined, and painfully aware of it. But over time, something inside me shifted. Their mockery, instead of breaking me, began to forge me into something harder. Each insult became another layer of steel around my resolve. Every whisper, another spark that kept the fire inside me alive. I realized that resilience is not born in comfort. It is born in resistance. And the more they tried to push me out, the more determined I became to stay, to grow sharper, stronger, untouchable in ways they could never imagine. I started treating every slight as a challenge. When they dismissed my ideas in meetings, I worked twice as hard to refine them, until even they couldn't deny the brilliance of the results. When they laughed about my background, I reminded myself that while they had been handed opportunities, I was creating mine from nothing, and that kind of hunger could not be taught. I began to see their arrogance not as a weapon against me, but as a shield that blinded them from noticing the strength I was quietly building. There were moments when the resistance felt like a storm battering me from every side. Rejections piled up like fallen branches, obstacles blocked my path at every turn, and more than once I felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down so heavily that giving up seemed like the only relief. But then I would remember the sound of that CEO's laughter, my father's silence, and the vow I had made under the stars. Those memories became my anchor in the storm, holding me steady when the winds threatened to tear me apart. Slowly, my resilience turned into confidence. It wasn't loud or flashy like theirs. It was quiet, steady, unshakable. No longer needed to prove myself to anyone but me, and with every task I completed, every problem I solved, my confidence grew like a tree with roots deep enough to withstand any storm. I began to notice something change in the way others looked at me. Not everyone, but a few. The same colleagues who once dismissed me started glancing at me differently, with hesitation. With a flicker of respect they tried to hide. It wasn't admiration yet, but it was the first crack in the wall they had built between us. The storm, however, never truly went away. There were always new whispers, new doubts, new hurdles thrown in my way. But by then, I had learned how to face them. I had learned that storms are not meant to destroy you. They are meant to shape you, to carve you into something stronger than you were before. And while they saw me as fragile glass ready to shatter, I knew I was becoming something else entirely. Something forged in fire and pressure, something they could not break. I started seeing myself not as the girl they ridiculed, but as the woman who was surviving what they couldn't. They thrived in comfort. I thrived in chaos. They inherited strength. I created mine. They relied on names. I relied on grit. And slowly, I began to realize that this storm was not my enemy. It was my teacher, preparing me for battles far greater than the ones I faced in those narrow office hallways. Every sneer, every dismissal, every whispered insult only fueled me further. I absorbed their mockery like lightning rods absorb strikes, turning it into energy, into determination, into proof that I was not only surviving but thriving. Because the truth was, storms don't scare those who've already walked through fire. They thought I'd break. Instead, I was turning into lightning. One bold idea turned me from invisible to unstoppable. It happened on a night like so many others, when exhaustion clung to my shoulders like a heavy coat, and the office lights had dimmed as most of my colleagues slipped away to their lives of comfort. I was still at my desk, eyes burning from hours of staring at spreadsheets, the air filled with the faint hum of computers left running overnight. That day, a new project had landed on my team's table, one that carried the kind of weight that could make or break careers. While others treated it like just another assignment, to me, it was an opening, a tiny crack in the wall I had been pounding against for years. I remember staring at the proposal late into the night, my pencil tapping nervously against the desk as my mind raced. The plan was flawed, shallow, and lacked vision, but no one else seemed to notice. They were too busy protecting their reputations to take risks, too comfortable in their privileged security to challenge the obvious. I had nothing to lose, and maybe that's why I dared to see it differently. I began scribbling notes in the margins, mapping out a bold strategy that no one else would have considered. It wasn't safe, it wasn't traditional, but it was fresh, ambitious, and dangerous in the way that only true innovation is. By morning, my desk was littered with crumpled papers, coffee stains, and pages filled with my restless handwriting. When I finally walked into the meeting room with my idea trembling in my hands, I could feel the familiar weight of doubt pressing against me. I knew what they thought, that I was overstepping, that my voice would once again be brushed aside. But this time, I didn't hold back. I stood, presented my vision, and for the first time, I refused to let their interruptions silence me. I spoke with a conviction that even surprised me, my words steady, my eyes burning with a fire I had carried for too long in silence. At first, the room was quiet. I could see skepticism etched across their faces, the same dismissive smirks I had grown used to. But then, something shifted. One of the senior partners leaned forward, his brows furrowed, not in disapproval, but in interest. Another began jotting notes, his head nodding slowly, as I explained how my idea could transform not just the project, but the company's position in the market. By the time I finished, the silence in the room was no longer cold or dismissive. It was charged, alive, filled with the weight of possibility. That day marked the first time my name was attached to something greater than the whispers of mockery. My idea was not only accepted, it was celebrated. Within weeks, it became the backbone of a campaign that drew attention from investors, clients, and competitors alike. Suddenly, the same colleagues who had ignored me were leaning over my desk, asking questions, seeking my opinion, eager to be associated with the work they had once dismissed. It was strange, almost surreal, to watch the shift in their eyes, from disdain to reluctant respect. And then came the recognition that truly changed everything. A well-known executive from outside the company had noticed the impact of my work and reached out personally, commending the boldness of the idea and the courage it took to push it forward. For someone like me, who had grown used to invisibility, his words felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. They weren't just compliments, they were validation, proof that my voice could not only be heard, but could carry weight in a world designed to silence me. Opportunities began to open in ways I had only dreamed of before. Invitations to sit in higher-level meetings, projects that carried prestige, introductions to people whose names carried power. For the first time, doors that had always been slammed shut were slowly creaking open, and I was no longer standing outside. I was stepping through. But perhaps the most shocking part of all was how natural it felt once it began. I had been fighting for so long just to be seen that when it finally happened, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt ready. Every rejection, every insult, every sleepless night had prepared me for this moment. I wasn't just proving them wrong. I was proving myself right, proving that the seed of ambition I had planted long ago was now breaking through the soil, reaching toward the light. Yet even in the midst of that recognition, I never forgot where I came from. Every success carried with it the faces of my parents, the sacrifices written into their wrinkles, the long nights my father had driven strangers across the city, while my mother stretched our meals to feed us. Their struggle was etched into my triumph, their silence and resilience woven into my voice. And though I was finally being heard, I carried with me the weight of those who still weren't, those who were still overlooked and dismissed because of where they came from. My breakthrough wasn't just about me. It was about proving that dignity and brilliance can rise from anywhere, even from the daughter of a driver. But life has a way of reminding you that every rise comes with its next test. Just when I thought I had finally found my place in this world, just when the winds had shifted in my favor, an envelope arrived on my desk. It carried with it a name I hadn't spoken in years, a name that made my stomach twist and my heart pound. It was his. And then came the invitation, the boardroom that would change everything. The moment I saw the company name on the letter, my breath caught. It was his. It arrived on a gray morning, tucked neatly among the stack of documents that usually crowded my desk. At first I thought nothing of it, just another envelope among many, the kind I had sorted through countless times before. But when my eyes scanned the letterhead, my heart stopped. There it was. The name that had haunted me for years. The name that carried with it both humiliation and fury. The name of the man who had once reduced me to nothing more than a driver's daughter. His company, his empire, his world. For a long moment, I simply stared at the envelope, my hands frozen, the air heavy around me. My pulse raced, memories crashing back like an unforgiving tide. The boardroom filled with laughter at my expense, the smirk on his face as he dismissed me, the silence of my father beside me. It felt almost cruel, as if destiny itself had been waiting patiently for this moment, preparing a stage where unfinished business would finally meet its reckoning. When I finally tore open the letter, my eyes devoured the words. I had been formally invited to present at a high-stakes boardroom meeting with his company. My work, my ideas, my reputation had reached far enough to pierce the golden walls he had built around himself. Suddenly, all those years of rejection, all those storms of whispers, all those late nights bent over papers and screens, every single one of them had led me here, to this invitation, to this collision course, with the man who once believed I could never belong. The days that followed were consumed by preparation. I poured myself into the project with a determination so sharp it cut through everything else. My notes sprawled across every surface of my apartment, my walls plastered with diagrams, graphs, and outlines. I rehearsed my presentation until my voice grew hoarse, until the words became second nature. Not because I doubted my knowledge, but because I knew this meeting was about more than business. This was about redemption, about justice, about proving that dignity and brilliance can rise from the most underestimated places. And yet, beneath my focus, a current of fear pulsed steadily. I would be lying if I said I wasn't terrified. This was not just any meeting. It was his. The thought of walking into that room again, of facing the same eyes that once looked at me with contempt, made my stomach churn. Would he even remember me? Or worse, would he remember and still see me as nothing more than the girl he mocked? I tried to push those doubts aside, but they lingered in the quiet hours of the night, whispering to me when exhaustion blurred my vision. My father noticed the tension in me, though I never spoke of the letter to him. He watched me work, watched the determination burning in my eyes, and though he didn't ask, I could see the unspoken question in his gaze. Why does this matter so much? If only he knew. If only he understood that this wasn't just about success. It was about rewriting a chapter of my life that had been stained with humiliation. On the morning of the meeting, I stood before the mirror, adjusting the blazer I had chosen carefully. It was no longer borrowed, no longer second-hand. It was mine, tailored to fit me not just in size but in presence. I stared at my reflection, remembering the girl who had once walked into a boardroom trembling, clutching notes with shaking hands, and I realized how much had changed. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer afraid of being silenced. I was ready. The car ride to the skyscraper felt surreal. The city buzzed outside the window, alive with the hum of ambition and opportunity, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. The building rose into view, the same tower of glass and steel that had once felt like a fortress designed to keep people like me out. Now, it stood before me not as a barrier, but as a battlefield, one I was prepared to walk into with my head held high. As I stepped into the lobby, memories collided with reality. The marble floors, the chandeliers, the polished air of wealth, it was all the same. Yet this time I was different. I walked with purpose, with a quiet fire in my eyes that no amount of privilege could dim. Every step echoed with the weight of years of struggle. Every breath carried the strength of promises I had made to myself. When I reached the door of the boardroom, my hand paused on the handle. For a moment, I let myself feel everything: the fear, the anger, the determination, the unrelenting drive that had brought me here. And then I inhaled deeply, steadying myself, because I knew this was not just about walking into a room. This was about walking into my past and rewriting it with my present. The whispers of doubt tried to follow me, but I silenced them with one thought. I had earned this. I had built this moment with sweat, sacrifice, and relentless resolve. Whatever awaited me inside, I was no longer the girl who had been mocked. I was the woman who had fought her way here. And as I pushed the door open, the hum of voices inside quieted, and I stepped into the space where it had all once begun. Only this time, I wasn't standing outside, trembling in shame. This time I wouldn't be standing outside. I'd be sitting at the table. When I walked into the boardroom, his jaw dropped. He didn't expect me there. The moment I stepped through those heavy glass doors, the room seemed to freeze. Conversations halted mid-sentence, papers rustled to silence, and all eyes turned toward me. But none were more piercing than his. The CEO who had once mocked me into silence, who had reduced me to nothing more than the daughter of his driver. His jaw slackened, his hand paused mid-gesture, and for the first time, I saw something flicker across his face that I had never seen before. Disbelief. He had expected many things that morning. Another parade of executives eager to impress him, another round of ideas he could bend to his will, but he had not expected me. In his world, people like me weren't supposed to rise. We weren't supposed to climb out of the shadows he had cast over us. But there I was, standing tall, walking toward the table not as a trembling girl clutching crumpled notes, but as a woman who had fought her way back into the very space he once tried to push me out of. The silence stretched uncomfortably as I took my seat. I could feel his eyes burning into me, searching for the girl he had humiliated. But she was gone. In her place sat someone who had been forged in rejection, sharpened by resistance, and strengthened by ambition. I adjusted my blazer, opened my folder, and looked around the room with calm confidence, meeting every gaze without flinching. For the first time, I wasn't shrinking. I was expanding, filling the space that had once made me feel so small. When the meeting began, the CEO tried to collect himself, his voice steady but strained as he attempted to lead the discussion. Yet I could see the cracks in his composure. His usual arrogance, that untouchable superiority, wavered under the weight of my presence. Each time he glanced at me, his jaw tightened, his hand tapped nervously against the table, as if he couldn't quite reconcile the reality before him with the memory he still held. Then my turn came. The room shifted, all eyes moving toward me as I stood to present my ideas. I could hear the faint echo of my own heartbeat, feel the anticipation pressing against me, but I refused to let it consume me. I spoke clearly, confidently, every word measured, every point supported with precision. I laid out my strategy with a conviction that left no room for doubt, painting a vision so bold yet so practical that the room leaned in almost instinctively. I watched as expressions changed, skepticism softening into interest, dismissive smirks fading into focused attention. Charts and figures danced across the screen behind me, but it wasn't the numbers that captivated them. It was the certainty in my voice, the authority in my presence. They weren't just listening to ideas, they were listening to me. And all the while, I could feel his discomfort growing. The CEO shifted in his seat, his hand brushing his chin, his eyes darting nervously to the others in the room. He tried to interject once, dismissing a point with a sarcastic remark, but this time I didn't let him. I met his interruption with calm firmness, countering his words with evidence so strong that even he was forced into silence. For the first time in his empire, he wasn't the loudest voice in the room. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The same man who once mocked me was now struggling to maintain control, while I stood commanding the attention of the entire board. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about presence, about proving that strength can rise from the very places arrogance seeks to bury it. As I continued, My eyes found my father seated quietly in the corner of the room, called in as part of the staff to assist with the meeting. His gaze met mine, and in that moment I saw something I had waited my whole life to see. Pride. The shame and guilt that had haunted his eyes since that first day were gone, replaced by the glimmer of a man who finally saw his daughter standing where she was always meant to be. I pressed on, my voice growing stronger with each word, the confidence that had once seemed impossible now flowing naturally. Every sentence felt like a strike against the walls that had tried to keep me out. Every idea a reminder that brilliance doesn't care about background, wealth, or privilege. By the time I finished, the silence that followed was not one of dismissal, but of awe. And then, as I looked around the table, I realized something extraordinary. Every head was turned toward me, every eye fixed on me, every ear waiting for what I would say next. Not on him, not on the man who had once ruled this room with fear and arrogance, but on me. And as I spoke, the entire room leaned toward me, not him. I didn't need revenge. My success spoke louder than insults. The silence after my presentation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the cold silence of dismissal I had once endured in that same kind of room. It was the heavy silence of realization, of people recalibrating everything they thought they knew. Executives who had once barely looked in my direction now sat with pens poised over notepads, their eyes flickering with something new. Respect. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, imagined it in countless ways, but living it was something altogether different. I wasn't just being heard. I was being valued. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't even need to look his way to prove my point. My ideas had already spoken for me, louder than any insult he had ever thrown. For the first time, I realized I didn't need revenge to heal the wounds of the past. I needed recognition, dignity, and proof that I belonged. And all of that was unfolding before me in real time. As the executives began to discuss my proposal, I could feel the energy in the room shifting. One by one, voices rose not to question me, but to build upon my vision. They weren't challenging my credibility anymore. They were aligning themselves with it. Every nod of agreement, every "that's a great point" directed my way was like a small victory, stacking higher and higher until the weight of them could no longer be ignored. And then there was him, the CEO. The man who had once silenced me with laughter, who had reduced me to nothing in front of others, now sat uncharacteristically quiet. His jaw was tense, his fingers drummed against the polished table as he tried to mask his discomfort. But he couldn't hide it. I could see it in his eyes. The realization that the balance of power had shifted. He was no longer in control of the room. For the first time, his empire wasn't orbiting around him. It was turning toward me. It wasn't just that the executives were listening to me. It was that he needed me. He needed my vision, my ideas, my ability to see what others couldn't. The same man who had once mocked me for daring to speak now sat silently, knowing that without me, the deal on the table would collapse. The irony was almost poetic. He had spent years convincing himself that people like me didn't matter. And now, his success depended on me. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I didn't throw his words back at him, even though I could have, even though a part of me longed to. Because in that moment, I realized revenge wasn't power. It was dependency, and I was no longer dependent on his validation. My success was enough. Still, my eyes found my father in the corner of the room. He stood quietly, almost blending into the background as he had always done, his uniform crisp, his posture humble. But his eyes told a different story. They were wide, glistening, filled with a pride so deep it seemed to erase the years of silence, the years of guilt he had carried. He had witnessed my humiliation once, powerless to stop it, and now he was witnessing my triumph, powerless to deny it. And this time, his silence didn't ache. It spoke volumes. For me, this was justice. Not the sharp justice of cutting words or the satisfaction of watching someone fall, but the quiet, undeniable justice of rising so high that the very people who doubted you are forced to look up. I didn't need to remind the CEO of what he had said all those years ago. My presence in that room, my command over the meeting, my father's proud gaze. That was reminder enough. As the discussion came to a close, all eyes turned back to me, waiting for my final word. I gathered my papers calmly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to underline the truth. I had become the voice in the room. I had become the force they couldn't ignore. And whether the CEO admitted it or not, he knew it too. For the first time, the man who had mocked me had no choice but to listen. For the first time, the man who mocked me had no choice but to listen. Money fades, titles fade, but respect lasts forever. As the meeting drew to a close, the atmosphere in the boardroom felt almost surreal. The polished table that had once been the stage of my humiliation was now the platform of my triumph. The same walls that had once echoed with cruel laughter now carried the weight of my voice, steady and unshakable. For a moment, I let myself take it all in. The stunned silence of executives, the subtle nods of agreement, the quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had just shifted. The CEO, once untouchable in his golden throne, now sat subdued, his eyes cast downward as though searching for the arrogance he had lost. In that silence, I realized something profound. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need him to confess his wrongs or beg forgiveness. His silence was enough. His discomfort was enough. His dependence on me, on the very person he once mocked, was enough. Success had spoken louder than revenge ever could, and the weight of that truth humbled even him. I glanced toward my father. He stood at the edge of the room, not as a driver that day, not as an employee, but as a witness to justice long overdue. His eyes met mine, glistening with tears he tried to hide, but his trembling smile betrayed the pride overflowing from within him. For years, he had carried the guilt of his silence, the shame of watching his daughter mocked without defense. But now, he no longer needed to explain, no longer needed to apologize. My victory was his redemption too. Walking out of that boardroom felt nothing like the day I had walked out years before. Then, I had left with humiliation pressing against me, my head bowed, my heart heavy with doubt. Now I walked out with my head held high, my steps steady, and my spirit unburdened. The marble floors no longer mocked me, the chandeliers no longer felt unreachable. They were simply decorations in a world I had earned the right to stand in. In that moment, I understood what true dignity meant. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't titles. It wasn't the luxury of a golden office or the arrogance of power. True dignity was resilience, the kind that survives humiliation, absorbs pain, and transforms it into strength. It was the quiet persistence of my father, who endured years of service to give me a chance. It was the silent vow I had made under the stars, when the world told me I didn't belong. It was every rejection, every whisper, every cruel laugh that I had turned into fuel. The CEO may have held power, but I had earned respect, and respect, once claimed, cannot be taken away. It lingers beyond titles, beyond money, beyond time. It lives in the way people look at you, in the way your story inspires others, in the legacy you leave behind. For me, that legacy was not just my own. It belonged to my father, to the sacrifices he had made, to the love that had kept us going when the world tried to keep us small. It belonged to every person who had ever been told they weren't enough, who had ever been underestimated because of where they came from. My story was no longer just about me. It was about proving that dignity cannot be mocked out of existence, that respect can rise from the humblest beginnings. When I think back to that first day, when the CEO's laughter had reduced me to silence, I realize now that it was never the end of my story. It was the spark. The insult that was meant to bury me became the seed of my ambition, and with time, care, and relentless effort, it grew into something no one could deny. The irony was almost poetic. The very man who tried to erase me had become the backdrop to my rise. And as I walked beside my father out of the building, the sunlight pouring through the glass, I felt a peace I had never known before. Not the fleeting satisfaction of revenge, but the lasting fulfillment of respect. Because money fades, titles fade, but respect lasts forever. And that's how the driver's daughter rewrote the rules of power. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you felt while watching. Make sure to hit the like button if you believe resilience and respect matter more than money or power. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story that inspires, shocks, and makes you think. And remember, every story we share here is a reminder that dignity can rise from anywhere. Stay with us for the next one.